Havana, 1946. Inside the Hotel Nacional, the Syndicate wasn't partying, it was auditing a dream. Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo was bleeding cash, and one smoke-filled meeting would decide if he was building the future or exposing everyone behind it. Havana in 1946 wasn't just a vacation postcard, it was a cash register with palm trees. The war had ended, America was flush with money, and the underworld had a problem that looked on paper like an opportunity. Gambling was exploding, but the old Prohibition-era pipelines didn't fit the new world. Liquor was legal now. Soldiers were coming home, cities were changing, and the Syndicate, the loose, ruthless alliance of bosses, financiers and fixers that sat above street crews, needed a cleaner, bigger engine than bookmaking and union rackets. Cuba offered that engine. Havana had the right ingredients: a government that could be negotiated with, police that could be paid, ports that could move people and money quietly, and a nightlife economy that could swallow enormous cash flows without blinking. To tourists it was music and casinos. To the Syndicate it was a financial instrument, one that didn't require you to win an election to operate. And in the middle of that machine sat a different kind of problem: Bugsy Siegel. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel didn't look like an accountant, and he didn't act like a committee man. He was a headline in a tailored suit, a man who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like the temperature had changed. And by 1946, he was also the public face of a private project that was bleeding money in the Nevada desert, the Flamingo. Here's the contradiction that makes this case file worth opening. The Syndicate didn't mind violence, it didn't mind risk, it didn't even mind losing, sometimes if the loss bought control, or leverage, or a future revenue stream. What it couldn't tolerate was chaos disguised as ambition. And from their perspective, Siegel's Las Vegas dream was starting to look less like an investment and more like a personal kingdom financed with other people's cash. That's the core question of this story, and it's not a romance question, it's a boardroom question. When does a visionary become a liability? Because by the time the men gathered in Havana to talk business, real business, not street talk, the Flamingo wasn't just late and over budget, it was becoming a symbol. If it worked, it would rewrite the map of American gambling. If it failed, it wouldn't just lose money, it would expose who paid for it, who backed it, and how the cash moved. And that kind of exposure was deadly in a world built on deniability. So part one is about setting the board, the place, the money, the players, and the pressure that turned one meeting into a vote with consequences. Havana, 1946. The Hotel Nacional, the casinos, the back rooms, whether every detail of every conversation has been perfectly documented or later embellished, the shape of the moment is clear enough to matter. The Syndicate's leadership treated Cuba as a strategic hub, and the Flamingo problem followed them there like an unpaid debt. Because Havana wasn't just where you went to celebrate, it was where you went to decide. To understand why this vote mattered, you have to understand what the Syndicate actually was in practice. Not a single mafia with one boss, not a neat pyramid. More like a cartel of interests: East Coast money, Chicago muscle, West Coast expansion, and a handful of men who acted as translators between violence and finance. In this case file, two names sit at the center of the math. Meyer Lansky, the quiet financier, the man whose power came from understanding systems, casinos, banks, politicians, and probabilities. Lansky didn't sell romance, he sold stability. When he looked at Cuba, he didn't see roulette wheels, he saw a regulated laundering machine with a view. And Bugsy Siegel, the operator with a movie star face and a gangster's impatience, who looked at Las Vegas and saw something bigger than a skim. He saw a monument, a destination, a legalish future where money could be made in the open if you could survive the transition period. In theory, Lansky and Siegel were compatible. One builds the pipeline, the other opens the valve. In reality, their partnership carried a built-in tension, because the moment you mix institutional thinkers with a man who takes things personally, you don't just risk losing money, you risk losing control of what the money is supposed to do. By 1946, Siegel's control problem had a physical address: the Flamingo Hotel and Casino. The pitch was simple and brilliant. Nevada had liberal gambling laws. Las Vegas was still small, still dusty, still more promise than reality, but it sat on a highway of migration and post-war travel. Build a high-end resort there, something that didn't feel like a back-alley gambling hall, but a glamorous destination, and you wouldn't just make profit, you'd create a new center of gravity. The problem was that glamorous projects burn cash long before they print it. Construction delays, supply issues, overruns that never stop, contractors who smell easy money, and rumors, constant rumors, that cash was leaking out of the Flamingo operation, either through incompetence, theft, or the oldest fear in any criminal partnership, skimming. Now, in a normal business, a board would audit, it would renegotiate, it would replace management and move on. But in this world, the board didn't write memos, it voted, and that vote carried two meanings at once: an official business decision and a personal judgment on whether the man in charge could still be trusted to represent the organization. That's why Havana matters, because the Syndicate wasn't just debating whether to keep funding a casino in Nevada. They were debating whether Siegel himself still belonged inside the circle, and Havana, ironically, was the perfect place to have that debate. Cuba was already proving that casinos could be managed like industries. You paid for protection up front, you bought cooperation in bulk, you controlled the door, the tables, the staff, the count room, and you moved the money through channels that looked legitimate enough to survive daylight. Las Vegas, on the other hand, was still an experiment, and Siegel was treating it like a personal crusade. This is where the vote and the betrayal start to fuse, because if you're a boss or a financier listening to reports in 1946, you're hearing two stories at the same time. Story 1. Bugsy is building the future. He's spending because he has to. The Flamingo will be the model for the next 20 years. Story 2. Bugsy is out of control. He's spending because he wants to. The Flamingo is an ego project, and the books don't match the cash. A vote only happens when the second story gets loud enough that the first story can't protect it anymore. And there was another pressure pushing this toward a decision: visibility. Bugsy Siegel was famous, not just known in the underworld, known in society columns, known to reporters, known to Hollywood types. The louder the Flamingo became, the more it attracted attention. That's great for a resort. It's terrible for people who need their ownership invisible. So even if the Flamingo eventually succeeded, the way Siegel carried himself created a second risk, the risk that the project would succeed too publicly. In other words, even victory could become a liability if it put the wrong spotlight on the wrong men. That's the psychological trap Siegel walked into. He thought he was proving value by making noise, by making Las Vegas feel inevitable. But the Syndicate's highest value wasn't inevitability, it was control. By the time the Havana meeting happened, the Syndicate's question wasn't, can Las Vegas work? It was, can Bugsy be allowed to be the man who makes it work? And when an organization like that asks a question like that, it's not a debate about personality, it's a debate about governance. Who gets to spend? Who gets to speak? Who gets to be visible? Who gets to be unpredictable? Because unpredictability is expensive. It forces everyone else to spend money just to manage the risk you generate. So here is the problem definition for this case file: clear, cold, and simple. In 1946, the Syndicate needed a decision about the Flamingo's funding, and they needed a decision about Bugsy Siegel's status. Those two decisions were inseparable. The money question was the excuse. The trust question was the real vote. And in part 2, we're going to walk into that night in Havana, not as tourists but as analysts, tracking who had leverage, who had resentment, who had something to gain by cutting Siegel loose, and why the vote didn't just decide a budget. It decided who would be protected and who would be left alone in the desert with a very short future. The Havana room wasn't loud the way a nightclub is loud. It was loud in the way power is loud. Low voices, cigarette smoke, glasses that never looked empty, and pauses that carried more weight than sentences. No microphones, no minutes, no signatures, just men who understood that the only contract that mattered was what everyone in the room would remember the same way the next morning. In this case, the Flamingo didn't arrive as a dream, it arrived as a ledger, The first layer of the conversation was supposed to be simple. Where is the money going? Because the project was no longer a single stack of cash. It was a braided stream coming from multiple directions. Chicago interests, East Coast money, West Coast channels, and private lenders who were never meant to be seen on paper. The more partners you have, the more dangerous the accounting becomes. Not because the numbers are complicated, but because the accusations are. If you want to break a man in that world, you don't start by calling him a coward, you start by calling him a thief. And in Havana, the rumors had matured into a charge. The Flamingo was eating money at a rate that didn't match any reasonable explanation. Material costs were one thing. Post-war shortages, transportation, labor, those excuses existed. But the figures coming back from Nevada weren't just high, they were inconsistent. Too many invoices, too many subcontractors, too many emergency decisions that only one man had the authority to approve. Bugsy Siegel's authority. This is the first place the math turns political. Because in a syndicate project, the man on the ground is supposed to be a manager, not an owner. He's supposed to execute the plan, not redesign it midstream. But Siegel had a habit of treating any limit as an insult. If he wanted marble instead of tile, he got marble. If he wanted an imported chandelier instead of a basic fixture, he ordered it. He wasn't building a casino, he was building the version of himself he wanted the world to see. And the men financing it weren't paying for his reflection, they were paying for return. So the room starts circling the same hard question from different angles. How much has been spent? How much is needed? When does it open? Who is watching the books? Who's verifying that cash isn't being siphoned off into side deals? The answer that mattered wasn't spoken out loud, but everyone felt it. There was no clean oversight, because the project had been built around trust in one man's personality. And trust is not a control system. Trust is a gamble. Meyer Lansky understood this better than anyone. If you want to understand why the Havana vote became inevitable, focus on Lansky's position. He wasn't just a friend of Siegel, he was the man who had to explain the project to people who didn't care about romance, the people who wanted proof. Lansky's entire reputation was built on precision, on predictability, on being the man who could make illegal money behave like legal money, steady, scalable, repeatable. Cuba was his kind of environment. You structure it, you protect it, you skim it, you reinvest it. The system becomes the boss. The Flamingo was the opposite. It was a wildfire, and that's what made it dangerous. Not just because it might fail, but because it was the wrong kind of success. It was a one-man show, a single point of failure, and syndicate projects don't like single points of failure. They like layers, committees, buffers, plausible deniability. So in Havana, you can almost see the invisible organizational chart forming in the smoke. There were the men who wanted Las Vegas as an industry, regardless of Siegel. There were the men who believed Siegel was still the best frontman, public, charming, fearless, if he could be controlled. And there were the men who believed control was already gone. That third group didn't need proof of theft. They needed a consensus that the risk was unacceptable. Because here's the rule no one writes down. In a criminal partnership, suspicion is often treated as evidence. Not in a courtroom sense, but in a survival sense. If enough people believe you're skimming, you're already in danger, even if you're innocent, especially if you're the kind of man who responds to suspicion with anger instead of reassurance. Bugsy's temperament wasn't just a personality quirk, it was a business liability. He could intimidate a contractor, he could scare a rival, but he couldn't calm down a room full of investors who felt exposed. And by 1946, those investors had another option right in front of them, Havana itself. Cuban casinos were printing money in a way that looked effortless compared to the Flamingo's hemorrhaging. The Havana model was already functioning, a predictable skim, tourism, protected operations, friendly officials, and a steady rhythm of cash that didn't require building a city from scratch. So every dollar going to Nevada felt like a dollar being pulled out of a machine that was already paying. That's how investment decisions become personal, because when money is limited, even criminal money, the question is never only, is this good? The question is, what are we sacrificing to fund it? In a room like that, Siegel wasn't competing against legitimate businesses. He was competing against other rackets, against Havana, against New York, against Chicago operations that were already structured and profitable. So when someone in that room asked, "Why are we still feeding this?" they weren't asking like a banker. They were asking like a man who could order a punishment. And this is where the vote begins to take shape, not as a dramatic raising of hands, but as a slow alignment of interests. The same way a jury forms an opinion before the foreman speaks. People test the air, they watch who nods, who stays silent, who looks away. In that environment, Lansky's role becomes almost tragic, because if he defended Bugsy too aggressively, he risked tying his own reputation to a sinking ship. If he abandoned Bugsy, he risked triggering something worse, because Siegel didn't go quietly. Siegel didn't accept humiliation. Siegel made humiliation expensive. So Lansky's move, as the story is often told, was to try for a middle path, keep the dream alive, but put it on a leash, bring in oversight, demand receipts, force a timeline, make the Flamingo accountable to the same logic that made Havana work. In other words, transform Siegel's personal project into a syndicate asset. On paper, that's a reasonable plan. In reality, it runs into one simple obstacle. Bugsy Siegel could never tolerate becoming an employee in his own story, and the men in Havana knew that. They had seen enough of him to understand the pattern. If you corner him with numbers, he doesn't produce numbers. He produces threats. He produces rage. He produces defiance. That's not leadership. That's volatility. So the conversation shifts from accounting to governance, from where is the money to what do we do with the man. And that's the moment the vote stops being about a casino and becomes about a sentence. Because there are only so many options you have with a volatile, famous operator who sits at the center of a money pipeline. Option 1, keep funding him and hope the Flamingo opens before the room loses patience. Option 2, keep the project but remove him, replace management, bring in quieter hands, reduce publicity, and treat Las Vegas like what it really is, a long-term infrastructure play. Option 3, cut the money, let the project collapse, and write off the loss as the price of an experiment. Option 4 is the one nobody says out loud at first, but everyone understands as a possibility the moment the room hardens. Remove the man, not just from the project, but from the world. That's what cut loose really means in a syndicate context. Not just no more funding, it means no more protection, no more phone calls returned, no more friends in the right places. It means you are no longer inside the structure that keeps other predators away. And once you are outside, you're not just vulnerable to enemies, you're vulnerable to former partners who need closure. A betrayal doesn't always look like a backstab. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a door that doesn't open when you knock. So in Havana, the betrayal wasn't necessarily one dramatic moment. It was the moment the room decided that Bugsy Siegel was no longer worth the friction. And what made it worse, what made it deadly, was that Las Vegas was still unfinished, meaning the money was still moving. The leaks were still possible. The exposure risk was still growing. If the syndicate waited too long, they risked losing control of the narrative. They risked Siegel opening the Flamingo as a personal triumph and becoming too visible to remove without consequences. They risked him building alliances outside the structure, politicians, businessmen, legitimate partners, people who could complicate a solution. So the timing mattered as much as the decision. That's why the Havana vote, whatever its exact form, is remembered as a turning point, because it framed the Flamingo not as an exciting gamble, but as an urgent problem with a deadline. And in a room full of men who measure time differently than everyone else, men who think in weeks, not years, deadlines don't create pressure, they create outcomes. By the end of that night, the air in the room had changed, not because anyone declared war, because the room had made a calculation, and the calculation had an answer. Las Vegas was still valuable, but Bugsy Siegel was becoming too expensive. And the most dangerous thing about Siegel wasn't that he might have stolen, it was that he might react to being accused like a man who had nothing to lose. He could talk, he could expose partners, he could lash out, he could make the problem public, which meant that if the room was going to cut him loose, it couldn't be messy, it had to be final. because in that world, an unfinished conflict is a risk that keeps charging interest. So as Havana's casinos kept humming, as tourists kept laughing, as the city kept pretending it was only a playground, the men who treated it like a boardroom reached the kind of agreement that never appears in newspapers. They didn't just vote on a casino. They voted on whether the man running it was still protected by the organization that funded him. And once that protection is gone, the rest of the story is not about luck, it's about mechanics. In Part 3, we'll track what that vote set in motion, how the Flamingo became the spark that made Las Vegas inevitable, and how Siegel, left outside the circle, became the kind of target that attracts both professional killers and convenient denials. Once a man is cut loose in that ecosystem, the calendar changes. Before the vote, time is negotiable, delays, overruns, excuses, one more wire transfer, one more meeting. After the vote, time becomes tactical. Every day the problem stays alive is a day it can speak back. And Bugsy Siegel, whatever else he was not the type to quietly accept a reduction in status. He didn't have the temperament for soft exits. He had the temperament for endings that leave a mark. So the weeks after Havana, whether you treat the Havana gathering as a single formal conference or a cluster of high-level meetings that later got compressed into one legend, play out like a familiar pattern in power history. An organization tries to regain control of an asset, while the asset's front man refuses to stop acting like the owner. The Flamingo still had to open. That was the irony. Even men who wanted Siegel gone didn't want Las Vegas dead. They wanted Las Vegas without Siegel, because the logic of Vegas was now undeniable. Nevada wasn't Havana. It didn't offer tropical camouflage or a cooperative regime you could manage with envelopes. But it offered something Cuba couldn't, an American legal framework where gambling could be expanded, normalized and scaled into a domestic industry, less fragile geopolitically, more durable long-term. Havana was a machine that produced money fast. Vegas was a machine that could produce money for decades. That's why the vote mattered. It separated the project from the man. It turned the Flamingo from Bugsy's dream into our infrastructure. And infrastructure demands reliability. According to many accounts, the Syndicate's patience snapped, not because the Flamingo failed to open, but because it opened the wrong way, rushed, chaotic, and under a spotlight. Siegel seemed to enjoy. The casino business depends on one sacred rule: the house must look in control even when it's losing. A messy opening doesn't just lose revenue, it signals weakness. Inside criminal finance, weakness attracts audits in the only form available: pressure, more visits, more questions, more men standing too close while you explain numbers that won't line up. And the more Siegel felt cornered, the more he acted like a cornered animal, defiant, angry, convinced that if he could just push through, everyone would have to admit he was right. He wasn't wrong about the potential, he was wrong about the politics, because the Syndicate's real product wasn't gambling. It was governance, the ability to make a risky, illegal enterprise behave predictably. A casino is just a stage where governance prints money. Bugsy kept treating the casino like a stage where he printed a legend. That difference is subtle until it kills you, so the post-Havana period becomes a tightening, not necessarily a single straight line, but a net drawing closed, financial controls, demands for repayment, threats disguised as concerns, allies suddenly unavailable, phone calls not returned, introductions withheld. This is what betrayal looks like at high levels, not a shouting match, a withdrawal of oxygen. And then there's the final move, one that historians and investigators have described in different ways, but with the same basic conclusion. Siegel was killed in 1947, shot in the home where he was staying in California. The details of who ordered it and how formally it was approved have been debated for decades, partly because the people who would have known had every incentive to keep it that way. That ambiguity is not a flaw in the story, it's the point. Because in syndicate governance, the cleanest executions aren't just physically clean, they are administratively clean. No one orders anything on record. No one approves. The room simply reaches a shared understanding that the protection is gone, and then someone somewhere solves the problem. The Las Vegas fire in this case wasn't literal, it was structural. Siegel's death didn't end the Flamingo, it stabilized it. That's the coldest part of this case file. The man who embodied the dream was removed, and the dream became easier to manage. The public face was replaced by a quieter structure. The romantic chaos was replaced by accounting. And the moment that happens, Vegas stops being an idea and starts being a pipeline. Look at what the vote created, step by step. First, it clarified ownership, not on paper, but in practice. After Siegel, no single operator could pretend the Strip belonged to him. Vegas became what Havana already was, a shared asset governed by committees, financiers, and enforcers who understood that nobody gets to be bigger than the system. Second, it proved the model. If you can build a luxury destination casino in the desert and make it work, you can replicate it. Different properties, different fronts, different managers. That replication is the real profit, not one casino, an industry. Third, it professionalized the relationship between organized crime and legitimate development. The Flamingo era showed that you could blend contractors, bankers, politicians, and underworld money into a single project and have it stand in daylight. That blend would become the blueprint for how Vegas grew. Layers of ownership, layers of financing, layers of protection, not just muscle structure. And fourth, it sent a message to every ambitious operator watching. You can be brilliant, you can be fearless, you can even be necessary at the beginning. But if you threaten the investors' control, if you make them feel exposed, you don't get an argument, you get a vote. That is the governing logic of power in this era. The vote is not democracy, the vote is risk management. So when people say Havana lit Las Vegas on fire, the meaning is not that Cuba directly built Nevada. The meaning is that Havana clarified the Syndicate's priorities at the exact moment Vegas was becoming possible. Havana represented the old method perfected, bribery, tourism, and controlled skims in a foreign playground. Las Vegas represented the new method emerging, domestic, scalable, modern, and permanent. But you couldn't have the new method with old-style chaos at the center. You couldn't build a long-term industry on the personality of one volatile man, especially a volatile man who enjoyed being seen. So the vote didn't just target Bugsy Siegel. It targeted a type of leadership. It ended the era where a single gangster's charisma could substitute for institutional control. And that's why this case file matters beyond the headlines, because the story is not Bugsy built Vegas and then got killed. The story is, an organization learned that to build a future, it had to kill the parts of itself that were too loud, too personal, too unpredictable. It had to turn crime from impulse into management. That is the turning point. And it leaves us with the real closing question, one that doesn't belong only to 1946 or only to Havana. If power is a system, what happens to the men who think power is a personality? They can create the spark, but the system will always vote to control the fire. In the next case file, keep that rule in your pocket, because once you start seeing the underworld as governance instead of chaos, you realize something unsettling. The most important moments aren't the shootings, they're the meetings. The quiet nights where a handful of men decide who gets protected, who gets funded, and who gets left outside the door. And in Havana, 1946, that door closed.